This video is adapted from my original Reddit post. It's an analysis of the story and characters of Octo expansion, as well as an attempt at interpreting its metaphorical and symbolic meaning. The main contention I'm going to make is that Octo expansion is an allegory for Eastern religious ideas. This may seem strange at first, and some of my interpretations may initially seem to be reaching, but I'm very confident that you will agree that I'm onto something if you can make it all the way through. It will be important to keep in mind that I'm mainly going to be looking at what elements of the story may mean symbolically, and not so much the literal events that transpire. Furthermore, because I'm writing for a primarily Western audience, I will have to explain a few of the religious concepts that I believe have influenced the expansion. It's not my intention to promote or disparage any particular religion, simply to explain their ideas so that we can understand what the game is about. I will, of course, answer any questions that anyone has in the comments in case anything I've discussed is unclear. I will also contend that Octo expansion was influenced by The Matrix, and I believe that this is because it wants to communicate similar ideas. You may want to give that movie a watch if you're not familiar, as I'm going to be talking about it a lot in this video, and copyright restrictions may prevent me from including relevant clips. The influence of The Matrix is much more overt in Side Order, but I think that Octo expansion is actually more consistent with its themes. One immediately obvious parallel is the idea of a character who has become disillusioned with the society that they were born into, and subsequently escapes. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. When the game begins, the player character, called Agent 8, wakes up with no memories except for a vague recollection of the Calamari incantation. Cuttlefish is quick to tell 8 that he or she has survived some kind of battle against Agent 3. But having no memory of this or anything prior, from 8's current perspective, this conversation is the first thing that he or she has ever experienced. In a metaphorical sense, Agent 8 has just been born. This idea is further reinforced by the character creation screen, which depicts the character floating in liquid as if in the womb, or perhaps a test tube, considering Octarian reproduction is implied to be artificial. In any case, this seems to give the impression of a fetus-like state. But as Cuttlefish reminds us, Agent 8 has had a life prior to waking up here, so it may be more accurate to say that 8 has been reborn. You may already be aware that rebirth is a component of Buddhist and Hindu belief. Obviously, Agent 8 has not experienced a literal rebirth, but his or her disillusionment with, and subsequent defection from, Octarian society could be metaphorically understood on those terms. There's also a similarity to Neo's awakening from the Matrix in a pod which also resembles a womb, and they even show fetuses in these pods later in the movie just to really get the point across. It's pretty clear that the Wachowskis did this to suggest that Neo has been reborn, at least metaphorically, and I think the same metaphor is being used in the game. It's also notable that the player character wears black PVC clothing just like Trinity. The choice of an underground subway system for the game's setting may have been based on a similar location used in the movie, and the ringing telephone is undoubtedly based on the movie's use of telephones as a sort of portal between the Matrix and the real world. I think phones were used because they sound a bit like alarms, sort of calling you to wake up from the dream of the Matrix. As we shall see, the character in Octo expansion is also stuck in a kind of dreamlike illusion. You then spend most of the game trapped underground and enslaved to a corporation, completing seemingly arbitrary tasks because you're told to, and you're not shown any leniency if you drop the ball. You do get a monetary reward, but you also have to keep paying to keep going. Already we should be able to see how this mirrors many of our own lives in certain ways. The currency has no real in-game function because Pearl just gives you more if you happen to run out, otherwise it would be impossible to keep playing. For this reason, I initially wondered why the game includes such a seemingly pointless mechanic, and in fact I think its sole purpose is to reinforce this element of the narrative. In Octo expansion you are working for Kamabo Corporation with the goal of reaching Inkopolis, which you are told is the Promised Land, our first overt religious reference, and is only reachable after you have obtained 4 so-called thanks. Once again, this mirrors our real lives, though this metaphor is slightly more obtuse. Many of us put a lot of effort into acquiring things, whether that is money, property, possessions, romantic love, political power, luxury, new experiences, anything and everything that is considered desirable, and that we expect to give us happiness, pleasure, or satisfaction. I believe that the game uses Incopolis as a metaphor for this satisfaction. It's the destination that many of us spend our lives trying to reach, and the four thanks represent the things that we try to acquire, or goals that we try to achieve, in order to get there. Incopolis is called the Promised Land because it's where we expect to be able to get by acquiring these thanks. But notice that our character only believes that the four thanks will lead to Incopolis because the system itself told us so, and, due to our memory loss, it's the only system we've ever known. Similarly, in real life we only think that money, possessions, etc. will make us happy because we have been conditioned to think this by the society we were raised in. Particularly in Western capitalist nations, there is an unspoken assumption that having more is better than having less, that being rich makes you happier than being poor, etc. According to Buddhist thought, this is untrue and does not work. It is impossible to find real and lasting satisfaction from external and material things. In fact, these things are traps because they seem alluring and are often difficult to let go of. But if you look at your own life, you will likely realize that the appeal and novelty of new things that you obtain wears off, sometimes surprisingly quickly. Instead of acknowledging this, many of us fall into the trap of attempting to acquire the next thing that we find ourselves wanting, thinking that this will give us the satisfaction that we crave. And so we are stuck in a cycle of maladaptive behavior unless we realize that our approach is faulty. I think that the blender scene in Octo expansion represents this. Specifically 8 realizes that the thanks are a trap and that they do not lead to Incopolis. Continuing to engage with the subway stations is understood to be both pointless, and literally self-defeating. It threatens to turn 8 into a sanitized Octarian, which is a slave of the system, bereft of independence. Instead, 8 takes a different approach. In parallel to this, Buddhist monks often ordain because they have realized that material acquisitions do not provide the expected satisfaction, and therefore they renounce possessions and sensory gratification. They instead commit to following the lifestyle recommended by the Buddha. They are still trying to find satisfaction, but through spiritual practice and self-reflection rather than through material property. In other words, they also take a different approach. So the escape sequence may represent this commitment to spiritual practice. During this part of the game you climb up a giant statue, starting from the coccyx, visiting various other body parts along the way, and eventually emerging out the top of the head. This is similar to a Hindu practice called Kundalini. Practitioners of this tradition believe that people have an energy called the Kundalini stored within the sacrum. This type of yoga aims to move this energy up the spine, visiting various chakras on the way before it emerges out the top of the person's head. This may not necessarily be understood literally, but rather as a metaphor about following a spiritual path toward enlightenment, starting somewhere low and base and ending somewhere high and beyond the limitations of the body, and I believe that the escape sequence is using the same metaphor. During the final level, the telephone reveals his motivation. It's a short speech but it communicates a surprising amount. He says that he is dissatisfied with the Inkling and Octoling species because of their cultural superficiality and their pointless race wars. Although he's the villain, his complaint is actually understandable, and I'm sure most of us can relate to it. But there's also a sense of bitterness to his motivation. He had very high-minded ideals for what humanity's successor species would be like, but was disappointed once they actually evolved. Furthermore, he has decided to take matters into his own hands, and his proposed solution is not only hideously extreme but also preposterously naive. It is implied that the telephone was originally much more optimistic about humanity's potential successor species, but that was before they evolved. When he saw them for himself he became cynical, and seemingly not without good reason. But the problem is that this cynicism has led to bitterness, and this in turn has led to selfishness and callousness. But consider how often this happens to people in real life. How often do we lose the optimism of our youth and become cynical about society, about our lives, and even about each other? And how often do we then find ourselves participating in the very thing that caused our cynicism in the first place, eventually becoming jaded and selfish, concerned with our own desires and goals above all else? And this is just as true of the beggar as it is of the billionaire, and in this way greed and self-interest have proliferated throughout society, and as a consequence the whole world is now threatened with ecological collapse because of actions taken in pursuit of the unreachable promised land. The telephone's cynicism may not be unfounded, but that's not the mistake that he makes. The mistake is that he does not accept the situation for what it is, and instead tries to change it by force and take control of the world. From a Buddhist perspective, this demonstrates a fundamental lack of wisdom. Buddhist teachers do not, usually, advocate attempts to control your external circumstances in order to get what you think you want. For one thing, as already discussed, the thing that you think you want won't give you the satisfaction you expect. But more to the point, you almost never have all the information necessary to control the world around you in a way that is competent. Therefore Buddhists and Taoists have long advocated a relaxed attitude of living in the world rather than a combative attitude of fighting against it. In other words, it's a matter of allowing the flow of the river to carry you rather than struggling against the current. One approach is relaxed, the other will exhaust you. The irony of the telephone's character is that if he had carried out his original directive despite his misgivings about the cephalopod races, the scientific and cultural impact of the knowledge that he was supposed to provide to them could have profoundly altered their societies. It may even have led them in a direction that he would have approved of. Conversely, the actions that he actually takes are unlikely to produce the results that he wants. The telephone tells us that he used the blender to murder anyone capable of collecting the four thanks, and believes that the resulting fluid can be used to create a form of life that will not be held back by the flaws that he sees in the Inklings and the Octolings. The telephone specifically refers to these victims as the best and the brightest, a statement dripping with delusions of meritocracy. Notice that there is almost no correlation between what the telephone complains about, and what his subway stations actually test for. Some of them do require you to think before you act, but mostly they test your reflexes and familiarity with game mechanics, and on some of them you just need luck. The point is that you could be an uneducated and underachieving moron, the very type of person that the telephone would want to wipe out, and still beat all the levels. Some people might cry ludonarrative dissonance upon realizing this, but I think this seeming discrepancy is actually deliberate. One of the most popular delusions in our society is the idea that the most successful people are the best and the brightest, the most hardworking, etc. We now know that in fact the most successful people are successful because they have the right kind of charisma, or because they can intimidate others, or because they reinvested a large inheritance, or whatever. It doesn't usually have very much to do with their actual ability or intelligence or anything like that. The unavoidable conclusion is that meritocracy is a delusion, but unsurprisingly it's a delusion that successful people tend to buy into. But as the game's themes suggest, it's a mistake to think of such people as actually being successful or lucky in the first place because you can't find satisfaction through wealth, status, or luxury. The telephone believes he has created a soup of the best and the brightest, but it is in fact a slurry of people who were deceived by the illusion of materialistic fulfillment. Because that's what the quest for the four thanks represents, so that's what was in the minds of the people who were turned into this stuff. That's what's really being proliferated by the telephone's bitterness and selfishness, so this could be seen as a metaphor about how our society's problems are self-reinforcing, a demonic feedback loop of greed. This brings us to sanitization. The telephone has infused this fluid into Octarians and as a result they are loyal to Kamaboko, seemingly hypnotized in some way. Remember that Kamabo is the entire society in the expansion, metaphorically and perhaps also literally. So these sanitized Octarians represent ordinary people who are hypnotized by the illusion of the society that they live in, and are therefore controlled by it. As Morpheus says, you have to understand, most of these people aren't ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inured, so helplessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it. I think the sanitization ink represents the influences that mislead us to that dependency, which in real life is the combined impact of what we pick up from the people around us as we grow up. This explains why the sanitization ink is blended people. The influence it represents is an amalgamation of what we unconsciously infer and absorb from a wide range of different individuals, all of whom are afflicted with slight variations on the same faulty perspectives. Our minds are cultural sponges, especially during childhood and adolescence, and our entire way of thinking in adulthood results from what was imprinted into us during those developmental years. The penultimate level is a fight against Agent 3, the protagonist from the single-player mode in the first Splatoon game, corrupted by Kamabo Inc. Within the literal lore of Splatoon, Agent 3 and Agent 8 are completely different characters, but metaphorically you are fighting against yourself, so I think this represents an internal struggle. Remember that 8 has committed a considerable amount of time and effort into collecting the 4 thanks, meaning that 8 bought into the materialistic delusion for a long time. Though 8 appears to reject the delusion during the blender scene, the desire for material fulfillment does not disappear all at once. I think that the sanitized Agent 3 represents this corrupted part of 8's own psyche, and to progress it needs to be both confronted and healed. Many stories in Hinduism describe battles between the gods and various demons, and the demons always represent parts of our mind that cause us to do evil or selfish things, so they must be destroyed or subdued before a person can become liberated. Or perhaps more accurately, the process of becoming liberated is the same thing as the process of destroying the demons. We previously saw how the escape sequence resembles Kundalini Yoga. If we accept this, we must conclude that the Nils statue is actually Agent 8's body, at least symbolically. By extension, the telephone, being a talking voice inside the statue's head, must represent Agent 8's ego, or sense of self, which explains why it has an octopus face. According to the spiritual traditions we have discussed, the ego is a kind of barrier that obstructs enlightenment. While the practice of these traditions differ, they are all designed to undermine the person's ego, at least temporarily. Once this occurs, the person realizes that their sense of self is just an illusion, and so becomes enlightened. This is sometimes called ego death, and in some religious traditions is represented by an archetypal character who dies, or travels to the underworld, but is later able to return or resurrect. In The Matrix, Neo dies but comes back to life, and only then is he fully free of the restrictions of the Matrix. The Hindu goddess Kali holds a sword with an eye drawn on it in one hand, and a severed head in another. This seemingly grim imagery is often misunderstood by Westerners. The eye on the sword represents awareness, and the sword itself represents truth. Truth can be represented by a sword in this way because awareness of truth cuts through delusion. The head represents the human ego, which is the greatest delusion of all. Similarly, Agent 8 must destroy this giant robot head in order to reach Incopolis, which, as we've already discussed, represents the true satisfaction which can only be found through enlightenment. But you can't do it alone. You need Marina's help to ink the surface, and in the end you're not even the one dealing the final blow. According to Eastern thought, it is impossible for a person to become enlightened through any amount of their own effort. You can only cultivate conditions conducive to awakening by following a path prescribed by a teacher, such as the Buddha, who has already awakened. The final level parallels this also. You don't destroy the statue yourself, you just follow Marina's instructions and activate a few bombs that she drops on the statue for you. In this way you create a situation conducive to the destruction of the statue, which is ultimately done by Pearl. Marina started out living in Octarian society and later escaped after seeing through the delusions of that society. Who better to guide Agent 8, who is currently going through the same process? It's my suspicion that Pearl and Marina are stand-ins for Bodhisattvas, which are beings that have made commitments to help others become enlightened. It's also notable that these two characters are cultural icons in Inkling society, just as Maitreya or Avalokiteshvara, both famous bodhisattvas, are cultural icons in certain predominantly Buddhist societies. The game also has themes of memory and nostalgia. I still have some unanswered questions here, so I will share my thoughts and invite further discussion. As mentioned previously, Agent 8 loses all of his or her memories at the beginning of the game. You also meet Iso Padre, who claims to have been a former test subject himself, and has also lost many of his memories, implying that the memories were somehow erased by Kamabo Company. You then get the chance to earn memcakes, which are allegedly pieces of memory, seemingly Agent 8's lost memories, except for the fact that many of them concern things that 8 wouldn't have any memory of. Not only this, but you are able to share the memcakes with Iso Padre, who seems to accept them as his own memories. This all begs the question of who these memories really belong to, and as of writing this script I don't have an answer. I'm not even certain that memcakes are anything more than the small objects they appear to be, simply an image that reminds you of something. Iso Padre himself is an interesting character. He's a former test subject but was unable to complete more than 2 levels for unknown reasons. He presumably therefore has no memories from his life prior to becoming a test subject, and he tells us that he doesn't remember his original name. His suitcase is stuffed with children's toys, perhaps suggesting that he is trying to hold on to his past. He gratefully accepts your memcakes, but I'm not sure what use they would be to him if they are not his own memories. Beyond this, I'm not sure what to make of him. He may have been designed to resemble Morpheus from The Matrix, but I'm unaware of any other similarity between the two characters. At this point I'd like to interrupt my original script, because one user was able to suggest additional insight on ISO Padre's character, which I would like to feature here. Quote, I think that when Octolings go through the deep sea metro process, they drop memories. I think it's a kind of duality. Nostalgia for items and objects can trap you, but it's important to remember how an experience made you feel in order to really self-reflect. I think the process of focusing on the thanks and completing the levels makes Octolings forget to self-reflect, and this is represented by leaving a memcake behind. Even the memcakes that are physical objects have poetry attached to them describing how someone felt about these objects or describing a specific experience with them. Most of the Octolings had the same upbringing, so it's easy to assume all the memcake poetry is from Agent 8's perspective, but like you pointed out, some of them reference things Agent 8 wouldn't know about. Therefore they must be memories of Octolings who went through similar events. This all brings me back to ISO Padre. I think the toys in his bag are also things dropped by Octolings on their journey, leaving their childhood behind for ISO Padre to pick up. Isopods are scavengers after all. I think he is trying to fill a void with memories that are not his own, since he can't seem to remember anything from his own life. I think ISO Padre is meant to represent someone who has self-reflection confused with consumption, a basement dweller who uses others' experiences to feel a sort of proxy of a life through media, other people's stories, other people's nostalgia, to fill a hole in their heart. I personally think ISO Padre could have completed all the levels, but he never made it past 2 because he got complicit, comfortable being a scavenger of other people's memories, and as a result he lost himself in them. End quote. ISO Padre's general dialogue seems to have been intended to hint towards the game's themes. Some of his statements suggest wisdom, but others reveal ignorance. In particular, I'd like to draw attention to this quote. I ride a subway called Desire, on a long and winding path to Inkopolis station. This sentence is a key piece of evidence and supports my earlier assertion that the quest for the 4 thanks, which is facilitated by the Kamabo subway system, represents a quest for fulfillment through attempting to sate desires. The second part of the sentence also supports my suggestion that Inkopolis represents true fulfillment, which people attempt to achieve through materialism but is, in fact, only possible through spiritual liberation. It's notable that the telephone is also clinging to the past, its obsession with humanity being another iteration on the theme of nostalgia. People are often blinded by nostalgia. They may view the past as being better than it really was, or fail to recognize the flaws in something they have fond memories of. Humans are certainly guilty of the exact same faults that the telephone sees in the Inklings and Octarians, even to the point of wiping themselves out in Splatoon's setting. Yet the telephone idolizes them, unable to recognize that they were no better than the cephalopods. But the game also attempts to invoke nostalgia in the player as well. Levels on the subway contain giant floating toys and games, most of which are based on real-world products from a few decades ago. Many players will be old enough to remember some of these things, and the effect is both nostalgic and surreal. I believe that the reason the developers wanted you to feel like this is related to the Vaporwave influence. I'm not particularly familiar with Vaporwave, but I tried to understand it while doing research for this video. For those who may not know, Vaporwave is a genre of music made using samples from 80s and 90s songs that have been slowed down, distorted, and sometimes chopped up in weird ways. It's supposed to have a dreamlike feel to it, or perhaps more accurately it feels like it was inspired by a drug-induced hypnotic state. Here's an example. This is interesting because I get the same impression from some of Octo Expansion's music. Here's another example. There's also a particular visual style associated with vaporwave which involves muted colors, old computer graphics, and a statue of Helios for some reason. The statue is clearly a major influence for the final boss, although concept art also shows a non-vaporwave version, so it seems that the devs had this giant statue idea in mind quite early in development. The final boss is also partially based on the final shot of the original Planet of the Apes movie, a potent image invoking the idea of the end of civilization. I was interested in what Vaporwave tries to communicate because I thought it might give us some clues as to what Octo Expansion is about. It has themes of nostalgia just as Octo Expansion does, but one of the most persistent interpretations is that it's a criticism of capitalism and the false promises of a material-obsessed society, which I think fits perfectly with the themes that we've already discussed. Notice, for example, that all of these nostalgic items floating in the subway's stages are also corporate products that were easily discarded by society as soon as they were no longer profitable. They are also gigantic and floating in the air, and this surreal depiction adds to the dreamlike ambience. The train tracks that don't go anywhere also add to this effect. I think the devs wanted the game to feel dreamlike or hypnotic to suggest that the character is under the influence of an illusion, but can ultimately wake up. Some of the levels also contain medical IVs which may suggest something similar. Infusing anesthetic into you to keep you unaware and immobile. They are full of sanitization ink, which is made of people just as the pod people in the Matrix are intravenously sustained by the liquefied remains of the dead. In Octo Expansion, anyone who is overexposed to sanitization ink becomes an agent of Kamabo, just as anyone who is still plugged into the Matrix can potentially become an agent. But the fact that they are also medical equipment may suggest that you're in this state in order to fix something. This is also consistent with Eastern thought, which sometimes suggests that the reason you experience an illusory sense of separate self is just so that you can wake up from the illusion. In this way the world may be imagined as a kind of cosmic game. I've also noticed that one of the levels, C07 Totally 8-Ball Station, features giant bent spoons, and at least 3 of these repeat an animation in which they repeatedly bend and straighten themselves. This is possibly the game's most overt reference to the Matrix. In one scene a kid dressed like a Buddhist monk is causing spoons to bend by realizing their illusory nature. The spoon even appears in concept art, and I thought it was unused until I noticed it in this level. Even though it's only a background detail in the final game, the fact that an illustration of it exists in the concept art suggests that the developers considered it to be significant. I also wanted to draw attention to some writing which I found in one of the stages, C03-A08 Bump in 8-Ball Station, which is made up of letters that resemble Pac-Man characters and seems to say danger. The only place it occurs is at the end of this stage where it loops around the goal. It might seem strange that the goal is dangerous, but I think it symbolically means that the character is being drawn into the delusion, and some part of the mind is aware of the danger but can't make its voice heard. It feels like something you'd experience in a dream about some maladaptive behavior that some part of your mind is trying to get you to stop. I also found the danger sign on a bag in the train carriage. It's not clear who this luggage belongs to, but I wonder if it's supposed to represent its own psychological baggage. Alternatively, it may represent physical possessions which we become too attached to. One last thing to unpack. The number 8 is used a lot in Octo Expansion for the obvious reason that the protagonist is an octopus, and octopus have 8 arms. So the game came out in 2018, it has 80 levels, it has a 1980s theme, even the glowing thing is on the spawn points are shaped like the number 8. In a piece of concept art we see a wheel symbol that was planned to be used on the protagonist's backpack. This wheel is a Buddhist symbol called a Dharma chakra, which is typically depicted with 8 spokes. Most people are stuck in what the Buddhists call samsara. This is our ordinary conscious experience as we go about our lives. A person in samsara can be visualized as being on the rim of this wheel, and the wheel is always turning so that we're always going up and down. This refers to your state of psychological well-being. Sometimes you're feeling good and sometimes you're feeling bad, and you spend your whole life going up and down and round, oscillating between various emotional and psychological states. But according to Buddhists there is an alternative. The place at the center of the wheel represents enlightenment. It's a place of calm where the turning of the wheel no longer affects you. In order to get from the outer rim to the center, you must travel along the 8 spokes of the wheel, which represent the 8 components of the so-called Noble Eightfold Path. These are 8 principles which Buddhist monks and nuns are expected to behave in accordance with. You might be inclined to compare the Eightfold Path to the 10 Commandments from the Bible, but this is not a set of rules that you are ordered to follow. Instead, it's more like advice or instructions for how to become enlightened. The point is that 8 is also an important number in Buddhism, or at the very least it is sometimes considered to be auspicious, and the use of a Dharma chakra in the concept art seems to confirm the connection. Even though the symbol does not appear in the final game, it does suggest that the developers were thinking along these kinds of lines. If you've stuck with me so far, you may be wondering, what exactly is enlightenment then? The difficulty with explaining this is that it supposedly can't be fully explained through words, so the only way to truly understand it is to experience it for yourself. It seems to be some sort of altered state of consciousness wherein the person subjectively realizes that the distinction that appears to exist between self and other is, in fact, an illusion. Therefore you realize that you are one with everything, or more accurately, you are everything. For this reason you understand that, although your body can be destroyed, you cannot really die, because you are the universe, the ultimate reality which has no beginning or end. This also may further explain why the number 8 was used, because if you turn it on its side it becomes the symbol for infinity.